Let's talk about Anomalous Subsurface Environment, Volume 1, or Level 1, ASE1 by Patrick Wetmore. This is a D&D module for, well, officially for Labyrinth Lord, which is a retro clone of basic D&D, but it's adaptable to any version of D&D, really. I think its style suits a basic style of play rather than an advanced style of play in terms of basic versus AD&D. It is, let's read the back. That's probably a useful way to do this. Welcome to the Anomalous Subsurface Environment. It's not just a big hole in the ground full of money and death. It's also got super science. This module describes a classic old-school Megadungeon and the nearby city of Denethix plopped in the middle of a post-apocalyptic wasteland. Everything you need to run a Gonzo, robots and swords campaign is here. Adapts easily to all early versions of the classic role-playing game and its retro clones. So what are you waiting for? It's time to give your players what they've been asking for. You know, knives through their eyes and a tortured eternity of undead moaning. It's, yeah, Gonzo, silly. You can see that this is a really very good cover. I think this Brian Thomas? Is that a Glad Thomas cover? Or an Atom? I don't know. Yeah, it's Brian Thomas cover with really excellent old school vibes, Morlocks and white apes and adventurers trying to come to, well, there is a player's handbook first edition demon statue. But yeah, the tone is silly, the tone is Gonzo. It's a Megadungeon. There's some question about how many old school Megadungeons there really were that got published. We know, basically the point is, we know Greyhawk was massive, we know Blackmore was massive, and we know that Undermountain was massive. But of those, only Undermountain got even partially published by its creator in any meaningful sense. And beyond that, there aren't many other published, like 10 level, 1,000 room Megadungeons. So this is at some level a product based on the things that we kind of know existed, but maybe weren't that important in the middle development of the hobby, but are now kind of hold an outsized importance in our head because of how incredibly important they were at the beginning. That the heroes go down into the dungeon and keep going down, and the campaign as a whole is really predicated on the Megadungeon, not on everything else. So what we've got in this book is, well, the City of Denethix and Dungeon Level 1. There is also a second book, ASE 2 to 3, which is the second and third levels plus other material. And there is more semi-written or extant, but Patrick hasn't talked about developing material since, I think, late 2018, and I'm not sure how much he's played. And I think the general consensus is that probably we won't see any of that for at least a very long time, if ever. So at some level, you know, you've got 30% of his original material polished up and published, and then you have other material outlined on his blog at Henchman Abuse. And I run this. I don't feel too bad about the fact that there's not more coming soon, but it is a kind of something to bear in mind that this is what you've got, these two books. This book is the Region book. It's shorter than the second book. It's 84 pages, I think, or something. Well, before the OGL, it's 85 pages. It's the city book and some introductory dungeons and the top level of the Megadungeon. Then there are two more levels and I think a sub-level in the other book. So you got 300 rooms. That's enough. Given how most of our campaigns don't last that long or are not that intensive, that's plenty of material, I would say. So there's a lot here for 80 pages. We're going to go through it and talk about it as we go. There's some stuff about running dungeons, running cities. Those who aren't familiar with the original games, particularly OD&D and Basic, I think is the implicit context there. Denethix campaign setting. So we start off with a few pages on, if you like, a very high level discussion of the setting, and then we get into more detail. I think the campaign setting section is about 30 pages on the whole. So you've got history of the world. It's a high-tech world that's fallen into barbarity and magic. In that sense, it's kind of Dying Earth influenced, but it's maybe most specifically influenced by Thundar the Barbarian and a few other programs like that. Orbital gods. The gods are, at least on the whole, are actually AIs who you contact via technology and who miraculously grant power. The cult of science is not a religion. Religion's very silly. They just obsess about collecting ancient pieces of scientific information they don't understand. Church of Starry Wisdom, which is, kind of Cthulhu, the outer gods. Discussion on infravision. So demi-humans, this is another part of the setting. So you've got this science fantasy world, and that means, well, how do the demi-humans fit in? In Spelljammer, which is science fantasy, they fit in as fantasy creatures in the way that we understand them from their other worlds. In ASE, in this science fantasy setting, they are mutants or aliens, basically. And dwarves, halflings, and elves are, experimented upon or mutated humans or human-like creatures. Goblins are the constructs of an alien hive mind creature. So goblins are humanoids, but they are not human in the way that the others are. And then there are other other human-like humanoid creatures. There's Mokhtars and insect men of the Lanthanide Wastes, who are mutated intelligent animals, obviously. The Mokhtars particularly being based on Mok from Thundar the Barbarian. He's a kind of cat man, and that is what a Mokhtar is. Those classes are in the second book. So we come to the region that we are being given, Land 1000 Towers. Here's a map. Very functional, nothing high-tech here. But you can see all these different things have a paragraph to them, nothing else. The offshore arcology, massive structure of steel, somehow still stands. Saurian lowlands infested with basically dinosaurs who have been recreated. The feasting trees, predatory trees. These are all very much neon-coloured ideas, aren't they? And there's not much detail here, but then this is a Megadungeon book. The region is being offered as, at one level, dressing. We'll come back to that though. Denethix. Denethix is the city you start in. Denethix is one of many cities ruled by an evil wizard, because wizards are bad. This is the land of 1000 towers of wizards who are terrifying figures of arcane power and no morals. However, it's actually not too bad in Denethix, and it turns out it's because Foretha the wizard essentially had an aneurysm, and his captain of his guard and a victim he was experimenting on decided between them they would take over using Foretha, because they could still kind of prop his body up, using Foretha as a puppet. Factions of Denethix. So you can see on the whole, again, basically a paragraph per faction. And there's slaveholders, there's the cults, there are the various kind of governmental factions, including the Unyielding Fist. There are anti-slavery, pro-freedom factions. Personalities with a few stats for the two leaders of Denethix. And then locations. We also have a map, again, only functional, nothing exciting, but something that is clear and that you can orient yourself on. Again, here you generally speaking just have a paragraph. You also have lists of tavern names and major locations. So the Street of Worthy Servitude has lots of pubs, including the B and X Breakfast Pavilion for those Greg and Craig. So places your players can drop into. All of this is not tersely written, I'd say, but certainly briefly written and evocative. And we keep going through that, and you can see that there's lots of different places in Denethix. Denethix in that sense gets lots of detail, lots of individual locations, enough for you to run it, and then the towns surrounding it as well. Here is a Denethix region map with the towns surrounding it. The Anomalous Subsurface Environment is going to be on Mount Rendon here on the west. So you start in Chelmsfordshire, I think technically is the starting town presumed for the first adventure. There are, I should say, extra resources. This reminds me, extra resources mostly created by Gus L. Adventures, I think he's written 4 for the setting. So one, for instance, is based on this location, Obelisk of Unwanted Memory, which is actually a rumour I've given my players, and they've started investigating in our campaign. Denethix in the middle there on this river, the river Pristine, which turns into the river Effluent below Denethix as it goes to the sea. Now here is, so all of that, I'd say that there is, in one way, it's very narrow and brief. You could say 30 pages doesn't sound that brief, but of course you're like, oh, but there's only a paragraph for a town. There's not very much detail on the things out in the wilderness. You've got to make it all up yourself. Of course, one thing I think Patrick would say as well, that's just because this is a Megadungeon module, but there's more than enough to be engaging and compelling at a conceptual level. And just the fact you're like, oh, there's an offshore archaeology that is still intact and no one knows what's inside. Well, that's something where if your players get that rumour, they're going to go and find out about it. Now, what is provided, which does allow you to expand that world, Denethix and the Land of a Thousand Towers, greatly, particularly Denethix and its region of places controlled by this civilized state. In that sense, it is actually, incidentally, a classic Points of Light campaign, isn't it? The Denethix and the surrounding towns are basically not horrendous, whereas everything else is kind of horrendous. It makes you think the insect men of the Lanthanide Wastes are not the worst thing out there. What is provided is about 10 pages of tables, random tables. So we've got city rumours. D20 table of city rumours with lots of things you could do. The society who's been kidnapping slavers. Sometimes they leave the brain behind. Gross, huh? Is that the society kidnapping slavers? Probably not. Exalted brother Ulioma has been hiring an awful lot of Mokhtars lately, don't you think? Why would he be doing that? Unusual curios. Clockwork cat. Greasy blue stone, which is apparently a four-sided triangle which causes nausea if looked upon. Globe with shifting continents showing the movement of tectonic plates over Earth's history. Shops of Denethix. Random city events. So if you want to create an encounter table, that's obviously a subtable you could use. City encounters. Street urchins or beggars looking for handouts. Students on the town. Priests who may be doing all kinds of things. And then, in fact, you've got ones at the bottom here. Death lurks around every corner. Roll on the danger in the city table below. Or, what's up with that guy? Roll on the I have horrible secrets table below. Danger in the city. Muggers. Society of the Luminous Spark. Adventurers are part of the problem, not the solution, they cry. Opportunistic slavers. Town and village encounters, again, with options to go elsewhere. And then good, clean country violence. So you've got an encounter table for the countryside with werewolves and goblin raiders and buffoonish farmers' sons. Fashion for wealthy gentlemen. So you've just complete left turn there. What if people want to buy stuff? What if they want to have cool clothes? Haute couture for ladies of means. Barkeepers of Denethix, including people with horrible secrets. The horrible secrets might be they cannot die. They manufacture homicidal dolls. They're an aspect in Nyarlathotep. They are visitors from other dimensions. Rustic villagers, urban poor, bourgeoisie, opulent, the alien. So you've got all the kind of human people. Then there might also be dwarves and halflings and Mokhtars and elves and so on. Some ideas for gods. I generated one of these for my my PCs as one of my players' gods, rather than making my own one up. Henchmen, and then henchmen for hire. D20 henchmen, quite fun. Maybe not as good as the Hill Canton's henchman lists, but similarly, Melsgar, elf, male, strange fascination with halflings. Karo the sweet, fighter male. You know who's hot? Karo's hot, baby. Just one line personality about someone who may well not last very long as a backup to everyone else, but nonetheless. And I think 10 pages of those tables is a very efficient way to use 10 pages. I've just said 30 pages of the region leaves you thinking, man, I just want more detail on some of this stuff. And though the tables are pretty focused on the whole on the Denethix region, and the city and the region around it, rather than the kind of the land beyond, at the same time, it's something where those 10 pages being used to describe more stuff in the region might well get lost on every village's headman and a few extra rules about each place or one adventure hook. Stuff that might well be useful or good, I'm not saying it's not, but using the tables means that you have very flexible, condensed information which can be used for anywhere, and you can provide a lot more of it in the same space. And so, yeah, the tables is, I think, one of the triumphs of this product for the city book side of it, or the region book side of it. It is the post-apocalypse, so there are shotguns and plasma cannons and flamethrowers and repeating rifles, etc. Machine guns. Rules for all that, including ammunition rules and melee weapons, and manifold daggers and stun batons, miscellaneous equipment, gas masks, hand truck. This is obviously in a way you could say, well, you know, often you get the stuff marked as optional, and I'm trying to remember, maybe this is actually, but the point is that this is a Gonzo post-apocalyptic wasteland, and your players should want to have laser rifles. They should want to have like elves with laser rifles fighting robots in the darkness. That's the feel of it. You know, you should want your there's an evil wizard bringing his army, and you're like, man, what if we got loads of grenades? It's Army of Darkness, basically, isn't it? You know, look at my boomstick. That's meant to be part of the feel here, I think. And these are all very functional rules. I've used them. I guess that there's nothing. They're not automatically exciting, but then they don't have to be, I don't think. You've got exploding damage on laser rifles, things like that. You have extra damage, fire damage from plasma and stuff like that. They're fairly generic in that sense, but they are there. You know, just someone providing a very quick list of those things in a module is a way that is a reason you don't have to go elsewhere. And I think that's one thing that I'd compliment about these books, and I'll talk more about this as we go, is that they are complete enough to use more or less on their own with the rulebook. So you've got, I've got it here, Old School Essentials, or you've got the old BX box set, or you've got Labyrinth Lord, which this was made for, or you've got AD&D and you're willing to, or Osric or whatever, and you're willing to adapt it. Plus this, that's all you need. You don't need to go and get other stuff, because Patrick provides so much, and it is also functional. Like cost of living stuff, similar to occasionally tapeworm-free meals, food for the fancy lad, and quality fare. Now we've got wizards. There are 3 wizards provided here. There are more in the second book. Wizards are bad news. They're not good people. They want to hurt you, and they're weird. Basically, they're all kind of weird Thundar villains crossed with wrestler personalities. Basically, imagine a villain from Thundar the Barbarian or something crossed with a particularly an Attitude Era wrestler or something, but maybe the bad Attitude Era wrestlers. Like one is a farmer called Monsator, which is a bit on the nose, who leads an army of corn people. Canis likes hounds. Ferain, I think, is almost normal in the sense he actually just rules a city and is a wizard, but he has a kind of a flying head that he goes around in attacking his enemies. A robot head. So, again, you can use them or not. It's something where these things are somewhat modular, and if your player's just like, we're going to go into the ASE and that's it, and you as a DM very much facilitate that gameplay, then they never see any of that. But I know plenty of people who, I've seen literally half dozen or more people, maybe a dozen people, have said something like, oh, I just think there's so much there, or my players just did that, or I just want to go and do that in the game I'm in. The wilderness is interesting enough on its own, based on this kind of mixture of tables, the basic concepts, the statistical information provided, the wizards, to really get on with that, and that is boosted again by the second book. But you can just do it with this book. We now get to the dungeon, and we are halfway through. That's the thing, you know. It's we seem to have taken a long time on the City Region book, but that's because it's half the book. The ASE is a self-generating, self-sustaining thing, life form maybe, elemental force which likes being explored. So it's a justification for a Megadungeon, which doesn't require an evil wizard having made it or something. It's just there, and it keeps repairing itself, and it has its elemental spirits who do so. It was, before the apocalypse, discovered and exploited by a company called Dynemat, but then it was sealed in a disaster. Then the apocalypse came. Their description of these scientific materials, kind of a plastic-like material, a metal-like material, and a uranium-like material, which are particularly special. And now we get to the real meat at the kind of direct gameplay level, where you're just saying, we're now doing this stuff. This is, and I guess in that sense, I think that the gameplay level ultimately in D&D comes down to the dungeon, doesn't it? Even though that's not the only thing in the game by any measure. There are 3 dungeon-like environments, and in this, or if you want to put it that way, and it's hard to kind of compare them, because one is very small and is separate from the rest. The other is almost a starter to the ASE, and the third is a mega dungeon. So, but I think that's intentional. There is a tiering and a process, a kind of a way that I think there's an intentional training of players to deal with different this different style of old school play, and having this being a game I've run with players who had come from 4th edition, I think I've seen that in action, that this has been a game that has encouraged their old school play a lot. The first place, so you're told by 2 guards, oh, this thing's happened, we need help, and you're taken to this Mokhtar layer, and you can see it's very simple. It is a 9-room or 9-location map, and it is, if it was a Melan diagram, it would essentially be a single branch, wouldn't it? It'd be a single line with 2 rooms coming off it, if you want to look at it that way. This is not a complicated dungeon, but that's actually, though the Melan diagram I think is a very useful way to think about how interesting dungeon spaces are in the OSR playstyle. At the same time, there's real merit sometimes in having something simple, I think. And here, what I mean by that is, it's not inappropriate because what it's teaching is not mapping, it's not looping back. It's basically teaching the some very specific tropes and elements of the playstyle. Like, there are radioactive Mokhtars who might be, you don't want to get close to potentially. There are spiders in one room. There's a trap. There are 2 traps, in fact. There are different, and there are things to search around. So it's teaching you the elements of interaction without requiring the meta exploration of a looping dungeon. And yeah, this is good fun. My party managed to recruit. Here, basically, there's all these guys, all the Mokhtars in these rooms, in rooms 4, 5, and 6. 4, 5, and 8, sorry. And then there's one in number 3, and the one in number 3 is healthy and has a dog or a wolf or something. And my players, after clearing out the rest, managed to recruit him by feeding him. And I think they negotiated with the spiders essentially by feeding them dead Mokhtar so they could get whatever it is the spiders have, which is what do the spiders have in it? They have the lead carved box, which is important because there is a bit of uranium or the sick rock being hidden elsewhere that you really want to have in a lead lined box. I think my players actually in the end put the lump of sick rock inside their robot friend, who is one of the characters, using a class from the 2nd book. So that's just this training exercise, I think, and then you're going to go to Mount Rendon, but before you're kind of given a general link toward that, I think. And there's, you can open up the gatehouse, the kind of top level at Mount Rendon, using the uranium, and then that leads you to your 2nd dungeon. This is obviously, as you can see there, a very different kind of map. This is a much more looping map. It is a much more interactive kind of place in terms of there are factions, there are complex traps, there are multi-layer traps even here. There is one trap above another room, and there's kind of little oddities all over the place. However, it's still fairly gentle, and I think that's interesting. It's much more complex than the Mokhtar layer, but it still feels like, because though there are things that can just straight up kill you, I'm not saying it's gentle in that sense, but they are, if not gentle, at least open. They're open to the player to be able to say, okay, this seems to connect to this. Most of these things are fairly easy to pick up. Some things are very dangerous and will kill PCs, and that's standard. But there is a degree to which you're able to say, okay, I've learnt from the Mokhtar layer, now I'm coming here. And I think, again, this is another one of the triumphs, which my experience from reading reviews of it and stuff is maybe under-remarked, as a training module for players, that going from a very simple map to a more complicated map that requires mapping, if you're doing it that way, and requires attention and has bits that interact across a 32-room dungeon. But it's also isolated, so it's not something where they're going to go down into the ASE from here at this point, which is important because as part of the training exercise, not just for the kind of drama of the module, but for the training exercise, the players need to kind of put all the pieces together from this particular map. And then the Megadungeon opens up once they unlock the gate at 32. There's some fun things in here. There's factions of automata, basically, particularly, including an automaton or abomination, which is kind of the boss monster and can't be wholly avoided. Though I think because it's 17 HP, ASE6, so it's not actually very hard to hit, which is intentional, obviously, for a bunch of, at this point, their first level characters. You may have some beginning to level up as they go down into level 1. This is for first to second levels after all. 17 HP is something where I think my characters ended up wall of fogging him and then possibly taking like one hit, but otherwise managing, because he has 3 attacks, but otherwise managing to more or less just wall of fog him and then prepare attacks and stuff like that, and that worked. That was sufficient for the problem, including with characters with infravision. So what you've got so far is you've got a city and region book which is light but full of detail and idea. You then have these training dungeons, but it's only on page 52 of, as I say, 86 that you get to the Megadungeon. This is not a misstep. I think this is all very necessary. It does mean, as I kind of indicate, that you really perhaps want some of that other extra material if you're running a campaign here, because you're going to want to do all these other things. Not because this is not enough, but because there's so much in the world that you're going to want to do. What about the first level? Well, it is much bigger. It is. I'll get I'll see if I can get the map. There we go. It is much bigger. It's a real mega dungeon at level as you imagine it. It's got 101 rooms. It's got wide looping. It's got factions. It's got different environments within it. You know, some cavern environments, and I think there's even possibly one underwater room, and all kinds of different looking things. It has that kind of, and many entrances down below. Actually, I realise there's something else that might be worth quickly hopping back to. Time passes here. Before we get to level 1, there's also a mechanism where as your party descends levels from level 0, the gatehouse, time passes, and what this means is events happen. So there is an events marker, which means that as your players become more powerful, generally speaking, as they descend, more things happen. Entrances open up, events happen. So at this point, several hundred feet down from the gatehouse on the south face, there is an entrance by the 3rd level by a pond. There are Mokhtars there. On the 5th level, it's jammed by boulders. On the north side of the mountain is a deep pit to the 7th level with a black dragon. As it says, they will see the black dragon nosing around if they approach quietly, otherwise it will see them first, presumably with tragic results. And on the east face there is, by the 8th level, there is another one controlled by the government at this point. And that is the same for levels 2 and 3 in the second book. So there is an idea that this is a dynamic environment which doesn't need to change drastically. For the Mega Dungeon, I don't think you necessarily always want there to be just constant craziness happening and you having as a DM to almost tick down the timer, because Mega Dungeons are these sprawling environments which are tinderboxes for players, not for the DM, if you know what I mean. But I think giving a sense of reality that other people want to explore this too is really important, and I think from memory in the second book there are rival adventuring parties, or possibly that was someone's blog post, I don't know. But the idea that there are other adventurers wanting to come, there are other factions, this Mokhtar warband, the government of Denethix, who are interested in this new source of treasure, danger, whatever. So anyway, back to level 1. I would say straight up, it's not as interesting to me as levels 2 and 3. It's not the strongest of the 3 levels published so far, but in a general sense it is very easy to read and to use. It has a lot going on. It has lots of individually good things. So it has the factions, you know, the Morlocks, sorry, who feed on the goblins, and the goblins who might become desperate and bring out their goblin spider to battle. You can side with them. The Screechmen, who my players have interacted with fairly tragically for the Screechmen, in a room full of bones. Then there were some war crimes. But you have lots of individual set pieces which are nice within that. So there's a whole thing throughout the dungeon about crystal skulls that fit onto plinths and do stuff magically. So there is a whole kind of, as the players see more, that is a mystery, and it's not a mystery that has a deep truth behind it. It's not the Night Wolf Inn as a comparison, but a mystery where the players because they want to get stuff, are going to start messing around with this and be like, I remember the crystal skull plinth from there, or didn't we once do this thing with the crystal skull? Will it work again? There are lots of other things as well. There is the Sasquatron. There's just fun like kooky weird things like the Sasquatron, who is an animatronic Sasquatch. There are funky interactives like Room 51, Misty Arches, where there's just all kinds of experiences and weird things beyond the veil. I'll get it up here and read you some. Yellow mist in a scene depicting a costume ball with the guests recalling in horror from a figure dressed in rags and wearing a tattered white mask. Blah blah blah. Yes, they get to go and see the King in Yellow. The mural here is of a field of orange poppy flowers. Pouring the water down the basin will cause the character to become intoxicated, and he'll have a -2 to hit on all rolls. So, but other ones have beneficial effects. So that is I guess a Caves of the Unknown reference essentially, but it's a nicely executed riff on a classic. There is a good map. There are lots of places to go. There are lots of ways to sneak around and interact with stuff, and the characters or players who are interested in understanding maps, basically, who are interested in understanding space, will find it really satisfying. So, though, as I say, I wouldn't want to say this is, the best Megadungeon level ever, even by Patrick Wetmore. I would say it's very good. It's also all pretty easy and clear to read and clear to work with. The data isn't hard. There's not much bolding or formatting or very innovative use of space. Separate maps would be great. The dungeon map, this is I think the only version of the dungeon map, for instance, and that's not ideal, but this was 2011. This was something where we're still almost in the Wild West. We're just coming down to settlement, aren't we? And I think in that context this is very, very usable. Then there is a magic item section, which is pretty short and nominal. There are, I think, 3 magic items: Amulet of Vampiric Health, Circlet of Meat Detection, and the Malicious Mirror. And the Malicious Mirror has a table of malicious mirror reflections that people don't like. And so, yeah, that's just things where there's more detail than could be allowed in a room description. There is, however, then a big final section of monsters, 10 pages of automata and blade zombies and cornstalk warriors, minions of Monsator, corpse jellies and custodians of fiduciary duty and dobermans and dungeon elementals. Lots of different monsters. And so, I mean, if you're talking about, there are 2 to 3 per page. So let's say there's 25 or something, or 23 monsters or something like that. I haven't counted. But this is a real advantage. As I've said about other things, Wetmore is providing an entire setting book here. This is not just, this is a cool dungeon, and maybe I'll give you details for 1 or 2 unique monsters, but the rest are basically by the book or very quickly detailed. This is a monstrous manual or a monstrous manual supplement for a Gonzo science fantasy setting. And I don't know if there's any, or especially in 2011 there was any equivalent rival. You could adapt your Gamma World stuff or whatever, but in terms of this is D&D science fantasy fitting into a D&D framework, and here are just monsters that really fit that have that kind of weird offbeat thing, like that certainly have, you can see this picture of this Doberman, really feel like your 1980s slightly weird cartoons, which are a big inspiration. And I think that's, I mean, there's also variety as well. There's fun Gonzo creatures like corn warriors, nice riffs like the Mokhtars. There's semi-familiar monsters, but they're just a bit different. They've got detailed subtypes like the automata, and it helps the whole thing feel different to a classic fantasy environment with laser guns. This is not a classic fantasy environment with laser guns. This is something different, and it's an invaluable addition, I think, which, in terms of a book that just provides everything, that gives you so much, it is the perfect conclusion. So for the dungeon itself, if it's just about, what do I like, I'm less excited by ASE1. I'm running it right now. My party are in the first level. I mean, they're not currently, they're doing something else, but that's the level they're exploring. And I enjoy it. It's good. It's very easy to use. It's very evocative. There's a room full of bones. There's some weird stuff here. There's kind of bat people who screech all the time. ASE2 also has lots of other stuff that this book doesn't have, but then it doesn't have stuff this book does have. They are really nice companions in that sense. But this is an indispensable book, and not just because it's the first part. It's indispensable in its own right. It sets up a world beautifully, it offers enough random tables to and capsule information on the individual small places to run plenty of sessions. You could just say, okay, if you're a confident DM who's willing to just make a lot of stuff up, do a bit of improvisation as you go, then you will be happy, I think, with saying, okay, they want to go to this village, I've given them a rumour to do with this, okay, they go random encounter, okay, they have one, I'll roll on the table, and developing it all from there. And you can fill, as anyone who's run long campaigns knows, you can fill 3 hour long sessions with nonsense, basically, can't you? Everyone's enjoying it, but isn't immediately germane to the subject, but is something which is an invaluable part of the player's experience. And this book provides so much for that, let alone a very good 101 room Megadungeon level, let alone the 2 extra trainee dungeons. It offers, on that note, a training module for players. As I say, the 3 dungeons on this need to be approached sequentially, because of you need the sick rock to go to the gatehouse, and you need to open up the gatehouse to go to the main ASE. But they each introduce more aspects of the old school game as you go, and they do it very well. It's very easy for the DM to use. I look at something like the Mokhtar layer as an example, and I think you could say, if you took away the campaign superstructure, and you also understood and accepted it was going to be a pretty simple adventure, I think basically you could say to someone for their first ever session, look, this is easy to read, do you think you can run this? And I think most people would say, yes, I think if I just know the party are turning up and doing this, I could run that. It's that easy as a DM. I think this is underrated. I can't think of many other modules that actually spend the time giving practical routes to learning skill-based play. Famous learning modules like Tower of the Stargazer, Tomb of the Serpent Kings are interesting and good, but they are more explicit, but I think they're slightly less programmatic and intuitive. I think they give good advice to DMs about making specific kinds of... They're both kooky modules that give advice about, like, these are different ways to make modules, these are different ways that you make puzzles, these are different ways that players statistically might interact. However, I think neither is really focused on creating... I mean, there's bits and pieces, but neither I really think is focused chiefly on the player learning programmatically how to interact with the world. I think they are set pieces and demonstrations of design techniques, but they're not themselves the thing. And I think this might be at one level. It will also likely never be completed, but as a specimen work to look at and learn from, and as an incredibly deep resource to run that virtually no one is going to run out of material to use, especially when paired with the blog, it's well worth especially when you pair it with its sequel, it's well worth the purchase if you're interested in that idea, in the setting, and in the kind of campaign that having a Megadungeon implies. Which doesn't, by the way, mean you're always in the Megadungeon, but which does mean there is always a drawback to the Megadungeon. So I think it's available on Lulu still, and on Drive-Thru as PDF. If you have run this, if you have played in this, tell me what your experiences were, and I guess maybe some other science fantasy modules that you like. Until next time.